We've traveled this long road, each step guided by a desire to be better and to do better. Each step bringing us closer to the kind of world we would want to leave for our children. And so, delegates, on this beautiful day in March, we're called to stand on the right side of history. Let it be recorded that when history beckoned, we did what was right for the memory of the millions who suffered the indignity of the slave trade and those who continue to suffer racial discrimination. Let our vote on this resolution restore their dignity and humanity. I thank you for the opportunity.
I thank the President of the Republic of Ghana on behalf of the African states. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Lebanon, who will speak on behalf of the Asia-Pacific states.
Madam President, Excellencies, I have the honor to deliver this statement on behalf of the Asia-Pacific Group, as we mark today the International Day of Remembrance of the victims of slavery and the transatlantic slave trade. As we commemorate this annual United Nations International Observance since 2007, we honor today the memory of the millions of women, men, and children who suffered, perished, and endured unimaginable hardship as a result of one of the darkest chapters in human history. Madam President, the transatlantic slave trade was not only a grave injustice that deprived countless individuals of their freedom, dignity, and humanity, but it also left enduring legacies of inequality, racism, and discrimination that continue to affect societies across the world. Remembering this history is essential, not only to pay tribute to the victims and the resilience of their descendants, but also to confront the lasting consequences of this tragedy with honesty and determination. This day reminds us of our shared responsibility to preserve the truth of history, to promote education and awareness, and to stand firmly against racism, racial discrimination, xenophobia, and related intolerance in all their forms. Madam President, the fight against slavery is not only a legal or political obligation. It is a moral imperative. As we pay tribute to the memory of those who suffered from slavery and the transatlantic slave trade, let us reaffirm our collective commitment to justice, human dignity, equality, and the protection of human rights for all. Only through remembrance, reflection, and action can we ensure that such atrocities are never repeated, and that the future generations inherit a world grounded in respect, inclusion, and shared humanity. By working together with determination and solidarity, we can bring an end to this injustice and ensure a future where every individual lives in freedom and dignity. I thank you, Madam President.
I thank the distinguished representative of Lebanon, speaking on behalf of the Asia-Pacific states. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Cuba, who will speak on behalf of the Latin American and Caribbean states.
Madam President, Your Excellencies, distinguished delegates, friends, I have the honor to deliver this statement on behalf of the group of Latin American and Caribbean states, GRULAC. We express our deepest appreciation to the President of the General Assembly, Her Excellency Annalena Baerbock, for convening this commemorative plenary meeting, as well as to the Secretary General, His Excellency Antonio Guterres, for his remarks. Today is a day not only to remember, but also to reinforce the value of protecting the international community from the wrongs of the past. We would also like to thank Ms. Esther Phillips and Ms. Shahada Jack for participating in this meeting and for sharing their valuable insights. Madam President, we begin by paying our respects to all those African women, men, young persons and children who were brutally and forcibly separated from their loved ones and suffered the horrors of slavery and the transatlantic slave trade, one of the saddest chapters in human history. Today we also honor the indigenous peoples who have suffered and lost their lives as a consequence of the slave trade. The legacy of colonialism in Latin America and the Caribbean, resulting in deeply embedded and continuing structures of racism and discrimination, must not be forgotten or ignored. By remembering the past, we can contribute to a better understanding of this period in history and fight against its legacies, including racism and prejudice. We must also take action to dismantle racism and racial discrimination, including systemic racism, which continue to have an adverse impact on the lives of people of African descent around the world. Madam President, convened today under the theme Justice in Action, Confronting History, Advancing Dignity, Empowering Futures, we emphasize the need to progress from remembrance to action, from sympathy to commitment. The international community must take progressive steps towards achieving the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development and implementing the Durban Declaration and Programme of Action, which acknowledges that slavery and the slave trade are a crime against humanity and should have always been so. The group of Latin American and Caribbean states notes that in 2026 we will commemorate the 25th anniversary of the adoption of the Durban Declaration and Programme of Action, one of the most important international instruments in the fight against racism and in the promotion of racial equality. In this regard, we note with appreciation the ongoing negotiations of the Declaration on the Human Rights of People of African Descent as a milestone in the commemoration of this anniversary. The group of Latin American and Caribbean states echoes the Secretary-General's call for reparatory justice and to put in place reparatory justice frameworks to address this terrible history and its legacies. Reparatory justice is essential for repairing the present and building a future founded on dignity and justice. Collective action to advance the just and strong call for reparations is required. The group calls on member states to continue their efforts to integrate a comprehensive understanding of the legacy of the transatlantic slave trade into educational curricula. It is essential that we continue to educate the public, including children and young people, about the history and impact of the slave trade, as a way of addressing its legacy and promoting action against racism, racial discrimination, hate speech, and prejudice, as well as a means for reconciliation and equality. Those who do not learn from history are doomed to repeat its mistakes. Madam President, today it is imperative that we recognize the legacies of slavery and the fact that slavery and slavery-like practices still persist in the form of structural racism, racial inequalities, underdevelopment, marginalization, and socio-economic disparities affecting Africans and people of African descent throughout the world. The international community cannot stand by and do nothing in the face of such challenges. We must work together to dismantle the transnational criminal structures that perpetuate these and other forms of exploitation and oppression. The legacy of slavery must become a distant memory that will never be repeated. The group welcomes the proclamation of the Second International Decade for People of African Descent, 2025-2034, which will help to intensify our efforts to fulfill our shared commitments to recognition, justice, and development for people of African descent. The group reaffirms its support for the initiatives, mandate, and valuable work of the Permanent Forum on People of African Descent. Ending slavery's legacy of racism is critical for building a future of dignity and justice. much remains to be done to achieve the full equality of every individual in our region and throughout the world. We must continue to work together to take progressive steps towards addressing racial discrimination, racism, and hate, while mobilizing political will and resources. Let us continue to work towards a world that leaves no one behind. Thank you very much.
I thank the distinguished representative of Cuba, speaking on behalf of the Latin American and Caribbean states. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of the United Kingdom, who will speak on behalf of the Western European and other states.
Thank you, Madam President. Excellencies, I have the honour to speak on behalf of members of the Western European and other states group as we mark the International Day of Remembrance of the victims of slavery and the transatlantic slave trade. Today, we remember the millions of women, men, and children who were brutally torn from their homes and pay tribute and respect to their descendants. Slavery and the transatlantic slave trade was abhorrent, an act spanning centuries and causing profound suffering. We welcome this year's theme, Justice in Action, Confronting History, Advancing Dignity, Empowering Futures, as an important lesson for us. We must never forget the history of slavery and the transatlantic slave trade, as well as its devastating consequences and long-lasting impacts. The role of education and the duty of remembrance is crucial in this respect. We must understand history to guide us to make the right choices in the future. And human rights are the cornerstone of that learning, a global commitment to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the rights of equality and non-discrimination as a safeguard for future generations. We cannot change history, but we can and should talk about it. It is important that we engage in meaningful dialogue on sustainable development, on education, on health, on climate. To continue to make progress, we must confront the barriers and inequities that persist today. We remain committed to tackling these root causes by addressing racial discrimination, combating racism and xenophobia, and challenging all forms of intolerance wherever they appear. We recognize the establishment of a second international decade for people of African descent and the important work of the Permanent Forum in promoting and protecting human rights. We reaffirm our commitment to fully implement the International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination. Colleagues, we must also address the scourge of modern slavery and related forms of exploitation, including trafficking, forced labor, sexual exploitation, and forced criminality, mainly of women and girls, but also boys and men. Modern slavery has increased and forms of exploitation continue to evolve, including trafficking for forced criminality into online scam operations. We welcome the political declaration agreed at the 4th high-level appraisal of the Global Plan of Action to combat trafficking in persons, which reaffirms commitments to tackle these challenges. We underscore our commitment to prevention efforts to reduce the vulnerability of those at risk of trafficking and exploitation, and to ensure that victims and survivors are provided with the support they need to begin rebuilding their lives. Madam President, while we cannot rewrite the past, we can choose how it guides us and strengthens our resolve to build a more just and inclusive future. Acknowledging the harm endured is a step toward healing and a commitment to ensuring such injustices are neither forgotten nor repeated. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of the United Kingdom, speaking on behalf of the Western European and other states. I would like to inform the Assembly, as I said before, that we have received requests from additional member states to speak in this commemorative meeting, yet the speaking list has been closed. As the next speaker, I give the floor to His Excellency Khalilur Rahman, Minister for Foreign Affairs of Bangladesh.
Thank you, Madam President. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, it is indeed an honor for me to join this very important commemoration. At the outset, let me pay tribute to the millions of victims of slavery and the transatlantic slave trade, which remains a permanent scar on humanity, our common consciousness, and a stark reminder of moral degradation beyond comprehension. I also honor the extraordinary courage of those who stood against slavery and slave trade. My country, Bangladesh, stands firmly against apartheid, slavery, and genocide. Our Constitution rejects imperialism, colonialism, racism, and oppression. We firmly believe that no human being should ever again face the appalling tragedy of slave trade. Excellencies, this year we are observing the centenary of the 1926 Slavery Convention, and we are almost 80 years into the adoption of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights that prohibited slavery and the slave trade. Yet, we must acknowledge that the ideologies of slavery did not end with its abolition. They still persist today in social hierarchies, economic structures, and political systems. We continue to witness modern-day slavery in many forms and manifestations. Madam President, acknowledging the historical truth about the transatlantic slave trade and its lasting impacts is essential, but not enough. As we strive to realize the 2030 Agenda, we must renew our resolve to combat human trafficking. We must take coordinated actions on digital forensics, and we must invest in education and dialogue to build awareness of human and civilizational costs of slavery and slave trade. Madam President, on this solemn day, let us reaffirm our commitment to building a world where slavery and oppression will have no place. I thank you all.
I thank the distinguished representative and Minister for Foreign Affairs of Bangladesh. I now give the floor to the next speaker, Trinidad and Tobago, on behalf of the Caribbean community.
I have the honor to deliver this statement on behalf of the 14 member states of the Caribbean community, CARICOM. We express and thank you as President, and also thank the high-level speakers for their contributions this morning, and further take this opportunity to recognize Ms. Esther Phillips, first Poet Laureate of Barbados, a daughter of our own region. We acknowledge the presence of His Excellency John Dramani Mahama, President of the Republic of Ghana, and we commend the Ghanaian
gentlemen of the media.
chose death over a life of bondage. The Ark of the Return, the permanent memorial to honor the victims of slavery and the transatlantic slave trade here at the United Nations headquarters, stands as a solemn reminder of those atrocities, their enduring legacies, and the responsibility we bear to confront them with honesty and resolve. CARICOM believes it is imperative to shed light on the past as a way of not only acknowledging history and truth, but also confronting it and understanding its continuing implications, though many decades have passed. We therefore remain strong advocates for comprehensive education and awareness to improve knowledge and understanding of the transatlantic slave trade. Madam President, we use this occasion to also pay homage to our forebears who resisted oppression and fought for their freedom and rights. Their victory over their colonial oppressors paved the way for the exercise of the right to self-determination and for us to develop our free societies and our people. Their uprisings, revolutions, and resistance movements changed the course of history, championing, in the face of oppression, their conviction that human rights and dignity belong not to a select few, but to all. The transatlantic slave trade constituted a crime against humanity and has left behind deep and persistent wounds in our societies. A significant number of citizens of CARICOM member states are people of African descent. Today, the legacies of this brutal era continue to manifest in our lives and societies, contributing to factors that drive high national debt, persistent poverty, psychological and generational trauma, health challenges, and certain social ills. Slavery and its transatlantic slave trade also ingrained in societies across the world the false doctrines and ideas of racial superiority, entrenching the scourge of racism and racial discrimination against Africans and people of African descent, which remains as one of the most egregious legacies of this period. This year, as we commemorate the 25th anniversary of the Durban Declaration and Program of Action, we do so in acknowledgement of the persistent challenges we face in eradicating racism and racial discrimination across the globe. Member states must work collectively to address this problem. If not meaningfully addressed, the legacies of the transatlantic slave trade will continue to hinder the progress of people of African descent across the world. We have a responsibility to ensure that people of African descent are not left behind. CARICOM calls for the repatriated justice is firmly grounded in the region's 10-point plan of reparatory justice, which elaborates a pathway to securing justice for victims of crimes against humanity, the atrocities and exploitation of colonialism, and the enduring legacies thereof. CARICOM also welcomes the convening of the 5th session of the Permanent Forum of People of African Descent to be held in Geneva in the coming month, and we encourage the active participation of member states. Madam President, as we reflect on this commemorative day, let us do so with a view to not only acknowledging the past, but to developing the necessary pathways to secure a better future for all, grounded in our resolve to create a more fair, equal, and just world for current and future generations. I thank you, Chair.
I thank the distinguished representative of Trinidad and Tobago on behalf of the Caribbean community. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of the European Union on behalf of the EU and its member states.
Madam President, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, I have the honor to speak on behalf of the European Union and its member states. The candidate countries North Macedonia, Montenegro, Serbia, Albania, Ukraine, the Republic of Moldova, Bosnia and Herzegovina, and Georgia, as well as Armenia, Andorra, and San Marino, align themselves with this statement. Madam President, the transatlantic slave trade remains an unparalleled tragedy which lasted over 3 centuries and involved unspeakable atrocities affecting millions of Africans. 20 years ago, the General Assembly acknowledged the unprecedented scale and duration of the atrocities of slavery and the slave trade, condemning with the strongest words these human rights violations. The EU and its member states are actively engaged across all relevant fora to make progress on this issue, and we demonstrated our commitment through concrete domestic and international action. While the wrongs of the past cannot be undone, we must learn from them and strive to redress their enduring consequences in full adherence to international law by dismantling barriers and addressing the disparities that still prevent the full and equal participation of descendants in all aspects of society. We must continue to support efforts to shed light on the history of slavery and the transatlantic slave trade, as well as their causes, devastating consequences, and long-lasting impacts. We also acknowledge that more must be done to take into account the consequences of the transatlantic slave trade. This demands collective effort, rooted in a shared commitment to remembrance and the need to continue combating slavery in its contemporary forms. The EU and its member states remain open to every meaningful opportunity that fosters consensus and unity on this important matter. Still today, despite universal prohibition, slavery and slavery-like practices in the form of trafficking of persons for criminal or political purposes and other forms of modern slavery persist and constitute flagrant and daily violations of human rights. The EU is firmly committed to eradicating these abhorrent practices and actively works to eradicate slavery in all its forms through both legal frameworks and policies. The EU's Charter of Fundamental Rights enshrines the right to human dignity with the prohibition of slavery, forced labor, and trafficking in human beings. The EU regulation on prohibiting products made with forced labor reinforces this stance, enabling us to remove such goods from our single market, whether they are produced domestically or imported. Additionally, we actively support the International Labour Organization's fundamental conventions on forced labor, which are integrated into many of our trade instruments. In parallel, the European Union supports the international fight against racism and racial discrimination in all their forms, and is committed to the full implementation of the International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination. We will continue implementing global initiatives such as the Durban Declaration and Programme of Action, which marks its 25th anniversary this year. And just last week, like every year, the EU convened an anti-racism conference that brought together policymakers, civil society, and independent equality bodies to exchange best practices. Madam President, the European Union and its member states reaffirm their commitment to eliminating all forms of modern slavery and building a just and equal society for all, where dignity and human rights are respected and protected. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of the European Union on behalf of the EU and its member states. I now states Sahel.
Excellence, Madame.
Your Excellency, Madam President of the General Assembly, Your Excellency John Dramani Mahama, President of the Republic of Ghana, Secretary General, ladies and gentlemen, I have the honor to deliver the statement on behalf of the member countries of the Confederation of States of Sahel, namely Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso. On this day of commemoration of the abolition of slavery and the transatlantic slave trade, the member countries of the Confederation bow with respect before the memory of all of the innocent people who suffered unjustly from these abhorrent acts. It is deeply regrettable that societies calling themselves civilized deemed it normal at a certain point in their history to systematically reduce other human beings to the status of things, to torture them, to sell them, to deprive them of all dignity, and to deny them their humanity. Today's ceremony must not be limited to simply honoring the memory of the more than 10 million Africans who were deported and enslaved in inhumane and degrading conditions. It must also serve as an opportunity for us to identify the responsibility for the harm done to Africa and to humanity as a whole, and to affirm a strong collective commitment to act for justice so that such atrocities never happen again. Madam President, on this subject, some states prefer silence and prefer to suffocate the truth about these macabre events. At the time when a series of measures are brought into being to recall and commemorate other human tragedies, sometimes of far lesser magnitude. The Confederation of Sahel States believes, on the contrary, that the truth must be brought to light and the reparations must be pursued. And the current context calls for this as certain nations continue to treat Africa as a private domain to the point where their parliamentarians, like the slavers of yesterday who decided on the fate of millions of Africans, now presume to legislate on the internal affairs of the sister country, the Republic of Niger. The Confederation condemns the pseudo-humanistic and neo-colonialist posture, which reflects a logic of mercantilist and imperialist exploitation of the continent. Indeed, there is a common thread between the slavery and transatlantic trade of the past and the terrorism plaguing the Sahel today, namely in the enrichment of colonial and imperial powers on one side and the impoverishment and the fragmentation of Africa on the other. In the past, these powers built their economies by draining Africa of its human labor. Today's African natural resources are being plundered using strategies of terror and endless conflict, and this is done through terrorist mercenaries and other criminal armed groups that are financed and instrumentalized. Madam President, faced with the reflexes of these slave trading and imperialist states that refuse to accept the emancipation of the peoples of the Sahel and of Africa, the Confederation of Sahel States remains committed to supporting any initiative aimed at restoring the dignity of African peoples, including through reparations. We therefore welcome and fully support the initiative of the African Union to adopt a resolution which categorizes slavery and the transatlantic slave trade as the gravest crime against humanity. We also take this opportunity to thank Ghana for so eloquently voicing the continent's position on this question, and we express our deep gratitude to His Excellency John Dramani Mahama, President of Ghana. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Burkina Faso on behalf of the Confederation of States Sahel. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Cyprus, followed by the Russian Federation and Equatorial Guinea.
Thank you, Madam President, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. As we mark the International Day of Remembrance of the victims of slavery in the transatlantic slave trade, Cyprus joins the international community in condemning these crimes against humanity and honoring the memory of the many millions of enslaved Africans who endured untold suffering and injustice during one of humanity's darkest chapters. For the millions of Africans who survived the abhorrent conditions of captivity before their journey and the horrific conditions of the Middle Passage, a life of degrading treatment, servitude, physical and sexual violence awaited. Slavery and the transatlantic slave trade continue to stand as one of the gravest atrocities in human history and a profound violation of human rights, stripping individuals of their freedom and of their humanity. For Cyprus, a country at the crossroads of continents and civilizations, remembrance carries a particular resonance. Our history, too, has been shaped by colonialism, division, displacement, and the denial of fundamental rights. While the transatlantic slave trade belongs to a different historical and geographical context, its legacy of dehumanization, inequality, and injustice is a reminder that respect for human dignity must never be taken for granted. This legacy can also be found in the entrenched systems of discrimination set up during slavery, but whose consequences undeniably persist to this day. Remembering this past is therefore not merely an act of tribute, it is a duty to acknowledge truth, to educate future generations, and to confront the enduring legacies of racism and exclusion wherever they arise. Madam President, on this day, we reaffirm our commitment to upholding the principles that bind us as an international community: respect for human dignity, equality, and justice. We must continue to fight against racism, racial discrimination, xenophobia, and all forms of intolerance, and to promote inclusive societies. Remembrance must go hand in hand with action. By preserving historical memory and strengthening our collective resolve, we can ensure that the suffering endured by millions is neither forgotten nor repeated. Let us honor the victims of slavery and the transatlantic slave trade not just with words, but with a renewed commitment to building a future where the rights and dignity of every person are fully protected and respected. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Cyprus. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of the Russian Federation.
Madam President, the UN was established more than 80 years ago, and the purpose was to end the legitimacy of the racial supremacy theory and to confirm faith in the worth and dignity of a human being in the developing of friendly relations between nations on the basis of the principle of equality and self-determination. We should not forget that during the horrible era of colonialism, what was the norm was a merciless exploitation of people from Africa, treating them as chattel. It is notable that it was the colonial policy and practice which expressed itself in slave trade, apartheid, and other forms of racism was the source and feeding ground for Nazism, which launched the most horrid world war in the history of humankind. The scope of slave trade, including the transatlantic slave trade, were so huge that it's very difficult to take them in and assess. And the same applies to the burden which the era of colonial conquest placed on the development of the African continent. It was in Africa that the first genocides of the 20th century took place. Nonetheless, the subjugators to date have not apologized to these people who suffered, much less paid their material compensation for inflicting intergenerational trauma. Russia played a key role in adopting in 1960 at the UN of the Declaration on granting independence to colonial countries and peoples, and extended every assistance to the Africans in their struggle of national liberation, creating their statehood and economy, ensuring their defense, preparing their national specialists. We laud the way they broke colonialism, and we pay a great deal of attention to reparatory policy of the continent, and we intend to work together with our African friends on this, including through the Russia-Africa Partnership Forum. The issues of eradicating colonialism and neocolonialism were at the core of the discussions that took place during the second Russia-Africa Ministerial Conference in Cairo in December last. Madam President, the only opportunity for us to avoid repeating the tragedies of the past is if we keep the memory of the historic truth. And that is why efforts to fight the falsification of history is one of the key areas of Russian foreign policy. In this regard, we would like our support to the draft resolution submitted by Ghana on behalf of the African group on the declaration on the transatlantic trade and racialized slave trade as a gravest crime against humanity. We also support the decisions it made in February at the African Union Assembly aimed at declaring slavery, deportation, colonization, and crimes against humanity and genocide against Africa. Colleagues, the International Day of Remembrance of the Victims of Slavery and the Transatlantic Slave Trade is an opportunity for us to remember the fate of those who paid with their lives for the well-being and prosperity of colonial states. But our common efforts for historic justice should not boil down to just one date commemoration. They should be conducted permanently. We're convinced that the document for adoption today would be a milestone in this path and will contribute significantly to the strengthening of the international legal regime of fighting the ramifications of colonialism, racism, and racial discrimination. I thank you for your attention.
I thank the distinguished representative of the Russian Federation. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Equatorial Guinea.
Excelentísima señora.
Your Excellency, Madam Annalena Baerbock, President of the 80th session of the General Assembly. Secretary General, Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. My statement will align itself with the statement delivered by His Excellency the President of the Republic of Ghana on behalf of Africa. Your Excellencies, President of Ghana, we would like to welcome you to New York and thank you for your statement on behalf of Equatorial Guinea. We would like to express to you our recognition for being here with us today at the General Assembly as we commemorate this important event, the commemoration of the International Day of Victims of Slavery and the Transatlantic Slave Trade. President, your presence here shows how important this event is for Africa, and it bears witness to the tireless efforts that Your Excellency has been making to ensure that the international community and this General Assembly can finally acknowledge this issue and adopt a declaration on the matter of slavery and the transatlantic slave trade, and say that it is the most serious crime against humanity. Indeed, President, according to UNESCO, between 15 and 20 million Africans were kidnapped and transported against their will from Africa towards North Central and South America for some 400 years. Many died during their voyage. This widespread deportation effort and the subsequent effects has been considered to be one of the most heinous violations of human rights in the history of humanity. In adopting this declaration and through the relevant resolution, it will now be considered to be the most serious crime against humanity. The effects of this horrendous crime can still be seen in Africa, and the legacy of this continues to have repercussions today in the lives of persons of African descent around the world. Madam President, recognizing the past and building a future of dignity and justice, the theme for this commemoration, should lead us to take stock and to think about the sad, shameful legacy that was inflicted upon Africans. Those humans who were subjected to these crimes had little choice. Their only desire was not to die. On this day of commemoration, the Republic of Equatorial Guinea pays tribute to the some 5 million black women and men who were lost in the context of slavery. We pay tribute to all of those valiant fighters from many countries, Jamaica, Haiti, Peru, and the entire diaspora who were affected by these heinous crimes. Madam President, I would like to pay tribute to all of those who were able to build a memorial to honor the memory of those who perished in the context of the transatlantic slave trade, to honor all of those who paid with their lives. The President of Equatorial Guinea has also made a significant contribution to these memorial efforts. I conclude this statement, Madam President, by saying that we are all part of one family, one large family, which is the family of humanity. Within this family, there can be no place for discriminatory treatment against anyone. This year, as we mark the 100th year of the abolition of slavery at the League of Nations in 1926, we all need to honor the memory of those who perished, and we need to say that we must work together and say clearly, never again. Never again can we tolerate this kind of discrimination. We are all part of the same family of humanity. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Equatorial Guinea. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Vietnam.
Madam President, Excellencies, Vietnam aligns itself with a statement delivered by Lebanon on behalf of the Asia-Pacific Group and wishes to make the following remarks in its national capacity. Today, we honor the memory of the millions of victims of slavery and the transatlantic slave trade, one of the darkest chapters in human history. This history is marked not only by immense suffering and injustice, but also by enduring consequences that continue to resonate in various forms across societies today. We stand in solidarity with Africans and people of African descent who continue to bear the lasting impacts of this tragic legacy. In Vietnam, earlier chapters of our own history were also marked by profound suffering, loss, and the denial of fundamental rights under brutal colonialism. While each nation's experience is unique, many of us share a common understanding of the importance of preserving historical memory and upholding human dignity. As former United Nations Secretary General Kofi Annan once reminded us, I quote, "We may have different religions, different languages, different colored skin, but we all belong to one human race." End of quote. This simple yet powerful truth calls upon us to act with empathy, solidarity, and a shared sense of responsibility. To truly honor the past, we must confront it with honesty, humility, learn from it, and translate remembrance into meaningful action. Justice is not only about reckoning with history, it is about the choices we make today. To that end, we must uphold international human rights framework, including the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination. We must also invest in education, promote dialogue and cooperation, and address the lasting consequences of slavery and the slave trade, including through resolute efforts to combat racism and discrimination in all its forms. Honoring the past must guide us towards a more just and inclusive future for all, where dignity is protected, equality is realized, and such tragedies are never repeated. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Vietnam. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of the Bolivian Republic of Venezuela.
Thank you, President. The Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela welcomes the statements of those who took part in the opening segment of this meeting. We also welcome the participation of His Excellency John Dramani Mahama, President of the Republic of Ghana, at this meeting. We would also like to pay tribute to the memory of all of the victims of slavery and the transatlantic slave trade, including their descendants. Today we need to recognize the suffering of the millions of people who were forcibly removed from their lands and taken away from their families and subjected to inhumane treatment. We also need to acknowledge, in this context, the resistance, dignity, and the struggle of those in the midst of such barbarism who defended their humanity and handed down an example of strength and resilience. The commemoration of this International Day also reminds us that racism, racial discrimination, xenophobia, and related forms of intolerance are not relics of the past, which have not been fully overcome today. President, for our country, remembering this historic crime is not just an exercise of memory. It is first and foremost a moral and political duty. Nationally, Venezuela has promoted initiatives such as the establishment of a presidential commission for historic truth, justice, and reparation on the issue of colonial domination and its consequences. At the United Nations, within the group of friends in defense of the UN Charter, we pushed forward the adoption of Resolution 80/116, which established the 14th of December as the International Day against colonialism in all of its forms and manifestations. We take this opportunity to recognize the leadership of the African Union and the Republic of Ghana at the helm of this draft resolution on the declaration of transatlantic slave trade and racialized slavery of Africans as one of the most heinous crimes against humanity, which will shortly be considered by this General Assembly. Our country has supported this draft resolution from the very beginning, and we invite all delegations to support this initiative by voting in favor of it. we conclude by stressing that will only be genuine justice served when there is truth, reparation, dignity for the peoples affected, and a strong determination to eradicate all contemporary forms of colonialism, racism, and exclusion. Thank you very much, President.
I thank the distinguished representative of the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of France.
President, ladies and gentlemen, distinguished colleagues, I quote, recognizing slavery and the transatlantic slave trade perpetrated from the 15th century onwards in the Americas, the Caribbean, and in the Indian Ocean and Europe against African, Native American, Malagasy, and Indian peoples are a crime against humanity. It is in these words that France, the first country in the world, officially recognized this crime 25 years ago, unambiguously through a law that carries the name of its author, Christian Taubira, and which touches on the ideals of justice, fraternity, and solidarity, which are the basis of the United Nations. The abomination of slavery affected tens of millions of men, women, and children for centuries, riding roughshod over their human rights and denying dignity. We commemorate with you the memory of the victims of this barbarism and the memory of those who fought it, the memory of those who worked to see it abolished. In the sinister litany of crimes that humanity has afflicted on itself, the Shoah, apartheid, ethnic cleansing, and mass murders, yes, slavery and the slave trade should be recognized for what they were, an abomination. Recognizing the truth of history and the duty of memory is what we need to do here at the UN. In order for the memory of slavery and the slave trade to be better understood and better known, we must support the work of historians. We must counter denialism and the fake news on social media, which is the new cancer of our time. France is fully committed to do this by working also with our overseas territories and with the African diasporas and our African partners. In 2019, we set up a foundation for the memory of slavery, and we will shortly be inaugurating in Paris the National Memory for Victims of Slavery at the very place where the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was adopted. We are setting up binational commissions of historians who are responsible for looking into our common past, for instance, with Haiti. We will continue to support the work in this regard of the UN, such as the UNESCO network of places of history and memory. We must redouble efforts to combat racism and modern forms of slavery, which are universal struggles. We must enforce the International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination, and we must continue this struggle even in the digital domain where hate speech can flourish. At a time when forced labor, domestic slavery, sexual exploitation, and migrant trafficking are rife, we need to ensure respect for the relevant ILO conventions and the UN Convention on Transnational Organized Crime. France supports the drafting of an international convention in this domain. President, the duty of civilization means that we must unashamedly combat the instincts of violence and destruction that humanity can harbor. Remembering the horrors of slavery and the slave trade is not just honoring the memory of the victims, it is also protecting the world and humanity. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of France. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Ethiopia.
Thank you, Mr. President, Excellencies, distinguished delegates. I thank the President of the General Assembly for convening this important meeting. My delegation aligns itself with the statement delivered by Ghana on behalf of the Africa Group. Ethiopia joins the international community in solemn remembrance of millions of African men, women, and children who were subjected to the horrors of slavery and the transatlantic slave trade. This day stands as a reminder of the gravest crime against humanity and historical injustices. The tragedy of slavery stripped generations of their humanity. The transatlantic slave trade and colonialism represent two of history's most extensive crimes against humanity, leaving legacies that continue to adversely influence Africa's contemporary socio-economic landscape and development trajectory. Slavery, apart from its cruel extractive nature, it disrupted social systems and fundamentally reconfigured economies, governance structures, and cultural institutions across Africa and beyond. As we reflect on this painful chapter, we underscore the importance of education, truth-telling, and the preservation of historical memory. We are of the view that acknowledging this gravest crime against humanity is crucial for honoring the victims and also for compensating with reparation for the atrocities committed. Addressing the structural and historical roots of inequality, including the socio-economic consequences that continue to affect people of Africa and African descent particularly, is important. Commemoration, therefore, must go beyond retrospective remembrance. It must serve as a call to confront the living consequences with courage. In the same vein, Ethiopia commends the leadership of Ghana on behalf of the Africa Group for successfully tabling the draft resolution declaration of the trafficking of enslaved Africans and the racialized chattel enslavement of Africans as the gravest crime against humanity. In conclusion, we pay tribute to the victims of slavery and the transatlantic slave trade, and also to those courageous abolitionists who fought to stop such atrocities. We hope this day would serve as a first step to renew our collective determination to rectifying the damage and build a world founded on the inherent dignity of all humanity. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Ethiopia. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Guinea.
Monsieur le Président,
Mr. President, Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, my delegation aligns itself with the statement made on behalf of the African Group, and we extend congratulations to His Excellency Mr. John Dramani Mahama, President of the Republic of Ghana, who is an advocate for justice and reparations of Africans. We thank him for his leadership on this cause, sadly an inheritance of more than 2 billion people in the world. Enslavement and the transatlantic trade is a dark chapter of our common history, and this has spread to several continents and continues to date to deeply affect our societies. For 4 centuries, anywhere between 12 to 20 millions of Africans have their lives destroyed through an odious system which anchored the capture, deportations, or racialized enslavement at the heart of their state. In the history of humanity, no crime has accumulated at the same time the same number of victims, duration, commodification, dehumanization, as was done by slavery and transatlantic trade. No crime produced consequences which were as lasting, in particular, the large-scale destruction of African societies, enshrining racialized inequalities, which unfortunately continue to be the structure of many ways of thinking, including in international relations. It's essential to reject these ways of outdated thinking and to redouble our efforts to fight against all kinds of enslavement, racism, systematic inequality, and structural injustice. Mr. President, on this day of remembrance, it is our duty to reaffirm our collective commitment to intensify our efforts to recognize the historic truth and to undertake measures to provide reparations for crimes. This is not so as to reopen historic divisions, but to recognize reality and the scope of this tragedy, and to make sure that justice is done, and this is begun by recognizing facts. Reparation and justice measures have to be extended to education and awareness raising, especially through forward-looking governance systems which protect human rights, which used to exist in African societies and were deliberately weakened and destroyed by slavery. In this regard, the Kurukan-Fuga Charter or the Mandinka Charter, proclaimed in 1236, have already provided the major principles of social organization and enshrined human rights, in particular the right to life and the preservation of physical integrity of everyone and the participation of women in decision-making. To conclude, my delegation would like to, on behalf of the President of Guinea, reiterates its congratulations to the Republic of Ghana for the efforts which resulted in submitting to our Assembly a draft resolution on trafficking and racial enslavement, and we urge all delegations to endorse this resolution, because by doing thus, we will be reaffirming our commitment to liberty, justice, equality, and the respect of human dignity. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Guinea. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Colombia.
Señora Presidenta.
President, Colombia thanks you for convening this plenary session commemorating the International Day to commemorate the victims of slavery and the transatlantic slave trade. This forum is particularly relevant within a global context where there are narratives that are resurging that aim to deny the past, to play down its effects, or to dehumanize people based on race, gender, sexual orientation, nationality, or religion. I would like to quote President Gustavo Petro. There is just one humanity, and we can overcome the current problems of our time, the climate crisis and poverty, by beginning with a dialogue between civilizations who acknowledge their differences. Slavery, the transatlantic slave trade, and colonialism are matters that left scars that still remain. In Colombia, we are well aware of the significance of these issues. They are part of our identity, our struggles, and our commitments. Indeed, confronting history means that we must assess the past honestly, to identify discriminatory structures that still persist, and we need to work together to dismantle them. In this regard, Colombia welcomes the declaration that Ghana has proposed, and we decided to support it as an expression of our commitment to historic justice and to ensure that persons of African descent can fully claim their rights. In order to advance with dignity, we need to acknowledge the ways and forms of exclusion that particularly affected indigenous peoples and persons of African descent, migrants, women, and other historically marginalized people. Recognizing these realities is an essential step to move towards public policies and international frameworks that can promote dignity, meaningful equality, and justice for everyone. In addition, empowering futures means that we need to beef up multilateral mechanisms and cooperation mechanisms to close the gaps and also to rethink how we relate with each other as regions and as peoples. With this in mind, Colombia convened the high-level forum between ECLAC and Africa that was held in Bogota, where we started a bi-regional conversation on how we can redesign our means of cooperation, trade, mobility and knowledge. That meeting showed that in spite of our differences, we are just one humanity, and our regions can build joint solutions to achieve sustainable development, historic justice, digital equality, health, the energy transition, and can strengthen our institutions. Thank you very much.
I thank the distinguished representative of Colombia. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Haiti.
Mr. President, Your Excellencies, ambassadors, ladies and gentlemen, Haiti welcomes the holding of this commemorative meeting on the abolition of slavery and the transatlantic slave trade. For us in Haiti, this more than just a symbol, this date. This is a duty of memory for us, a moral obligation, and a collective responsibility. We fully align ourselves with the statement made by the President of the Republic of Ghana and with the statements made by GRULAC and CARICOM. Mr. President, there are silences that carry across centuries, silences heavy with chains, with suffering and shattered lives. Today, as we take the floor, we do not want to speak only for ourselves, but we want to speak on behalf of all of those whom history has silenced for too long. Women, men, children torn from their land, stripped of their names, their dignity, and their humanity. Today we speak so that they may never again be forgotten. The transatlantic slave trade was not merely a tragedy. It was an organized enterprise of dehumanization. For more than 4 centuries, millions of Africans were reduced to the status of merchandise. Bodies were chained, lives were just numbers, existences were denied, and yet, even in deepest darkness, human dignity never disappeared. And Haiti is a living proof of this. Over 220 years ago, women and men, those who were said to have no voice, no rights, and no future, defied the world order. Not just to break their chains, they broke an idea, the idea according to which some human beings were born to rule and others to be ruled and dominated. And they affirmed at the cost of their blood a simple and universal truth, namely that human dignity has no color. And Haiti says today very clearly that our fight against racism cannot be candid and sincere unless it's accompanied by justice. In every time a child crosses a border in fear, every time one life is deemed less worthy than another, every time history is forgotten, It's a part of the same tragedy which continues. This is a fairly simple truth, but it seems to have forgotten. Haiti was born out of rejection of slavery, rejection of racism, rejection of the denial of humanity. And today it stands before you with an unbroken conviction. The world imagined by those women and men in 1804, a world of equality and dignity, has yet to be achieved. I thank you for your attention.
I thank the distinguished representative of Haiti. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Namibia.
Mr. President, my delegation welcomes the convening of this commemorative meeting of the General Assembly to mark the International Day of Remembrance of the victims of slavery and transatlantic slave trade. Namibia aligns itself with the statement delivered by His Excellency John Dramani Mahama, President of the Republic of Ghana and African Union champion on advancing the cause of justice and the payment of reparations to Africans on behalf of the African states. My delegation wishes to recognize with appreciation the participation of Ms. Esther Phillips, first Poet Laureate of Barbados, and Ms. Shahada Jek, first Youth Poet Laureate of Toronto, Canada, in this commemorative meeting. Your insightful and moving words added a significant value to our discussion, and we are grateful for your contributions. Mr. President, my delegation commends Ghana for its courage and leadership in advancing our shared commitment to addressing historical injustices committed against Africans and the people of African descent through transatlantic enslavement, colonialism, and apartheid, as well as the inequities that persist in the international economic and political orders. We recall that the atrocities of slavery, the slave trade, colonialism, apartheid, racial segregation, subjugation, and the exploitation of resources denied and violated the humanity and dignity of Africans and people of African descent. Their legacies are not confined to the past, as their social, economic, and cultural consequences continue to be experienced to this day. This year's commemoration is particularly significant due to the introduction of the resolution declaring the trafficking of enslaved Africans and racialized chattel enslavement of Africans as a gravest crime against humanity. This resolution offers the international community a collective moment of reflection on enduring legacies of slavery and affirms the African Union's commitment to reparatory justice, historical accountability, and healing of Africans and for the people of African descent. Excellencies, although the international community formally committed itself over a century ago to end slave trade, including through decolonization efforts and the codification of human rights, justice remains incomplete. In particular, gaps persist in legal accountability for colonial wrongs and in addressing the transgenerational social, economic, and cultural harm inflicted on our peoples, communities, and countries. This resolution, therefore, represents an important multilateral step in advancing truth, remembrance, learning, and collective moral responsibility, while keeping open pathways for continued dialogue on reparatory justice. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Namibia. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Nigeria.
Mr. President, Excellencies, distinguished delegates, Nigeria aligns itself with the statement delivered by His Excellency John Dramani Mahama, President of the Republic of Ghana, on behalf of the African Group and for his leadership in the discourse on this important issue, and in our national capacity underscore the historic importance of this event. We join the global community in the spirit of profound solemnity to honor the memory of the millions of African men, women, children who were victims of the transatlantic slave trade. This was not merely a dark chapter in history, it was a 400-year crime against humanity that fundamentally altered the trajectory of the African continent and the modern world. For Nigeria, this remembrance is personal. The shores from which our ancestors were taken are not merely geographical or geographic markers, they are sacred sites of memory, resilience, and unfinished justice. Confronting history requires history. The transatlantic slave trade was a systemic engine of exploitation to foil the industrial and economic rise of distant shores. Nigeria therefore maintains that true justice begins with a global curriculum that accurately reflects this history, ensuring that the roots of systemic racism and prejudices are identified and dismantled at their sources. Mr. President, advancing dignity is at the heart of our collective responsibility. As we navigate the international decade for people of African descent, we must recognize that the broken bones of slavery have manifested in modern society in systemic marginalization and racial profiling. Therefore, combating modern slavery is essential by eradicating contemporary forms of servitude, including human trafficking, which continue to stain our global conscience. Nigeria stands in solidarity with the people of African descent and calls on all member states to support the resolution to be tabled today. Supporting and voting in favor of this resolution is a roll call of conscience reflecting where member states stand in confronting racism and advancing the reconciliation of historical injustices. Mr. President, in conclusion, we should not let this day end in reflection alone, but it should mark a renewed resolve, a collective commitment to transform memory into action, injustice into equity, and pain into purpose. In doing so, we affirm not only the dignity of those who were lost, but the promise of those who carry their legacy forward. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Nigeria. I now give the floor to the observer of the observer state of the Holy See.
President, on this International Day of Remembrance of the Victims of Slavery and the Transatlantic Slave Trade, the Holy See delegation joins others in honoring the memory of the millions of people who were victims of enslavement. The Holy See unequivocally condemns slavery, including in its modern forms. The call for remembrance today is a reminder to all states of their duty to uphold historical truth and ensure legal accountability. As Pope Leo stated, since apostolic times, the Church has seen the liberation of the oppressed as a sign of the kingdom of God. This mission of liberation has continued throughout the centuries through concrete actions, especially when the tragedy of slavery and imprisonment has marked entire societies. These convictions have been expressed in numerous papal documents. For example, as early as 1435, Pope Eugene IV condemned the enslavement of the inhabitants of the Canary Islands and excommunicated those who refused to free them. Subsequently, in 1888, Pope Leo XIII condemned slavery as contrary to the Christian values, recalling that God, having created man a reasonable being and after his own likeness, he wished that he should rule only over the brute creation and not be the master of man. Mr. President, the draft declaration under consideration contains a partial narrative which regrettably does not serve the cause of truth. Historical memory, when based on accurate and impartial historical information, together with education and awareness raising, plays a fundamental role in preventing the recurrence of such grave scourges of humanity. At the same time, it is important to reaffirm that under international law, modern slavery constitutes a crime against humanity when committed as a part of a widespread or systematic attack directed against a civilian population. Therefore, the Holy See reaffirms that no one should be held in slavery or servitude as set out in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Mr. President, allow me to conclude with the words of Pope Leo, who reminded us that the freedom that Christ gave us is not only interior, it manifests itself in history as love that cares for and frees us from every bond of slavery. Thank you.
I thank the observer of the Observer State of the Holy See. I now give the floor to the observer of the International Authority on Development.
Mr. Secretary General, Mr. President, Excellencies and distinguished delegates, I have the honor to deliver this statement on behalf of His Excellency Dr. Warkana Gabayo, the Executive Secretary of IGAD. And I would like to confirm that my delegation aligns with the statement made by the Republic of Ghana on behalf of African states. We gather today in remembrance of a history that reshaped humanity. The transatlantic slave trade scattered families, separated generations, and disrupted the very foundation of human society. Millions were taken, communities were broken, human dignity was denied on a scale that continues to defy global realities. Its consequences did not end, they remain present. Across generations, many still live with the weight of that history through inequality, through limited opportunities, and through systems that continue to reflect those imbalances. Mr. President, although we cannot change the past, we carry full responsibility for how its consequences are addressed. That responsibility is not symbolic. It is practical, and it is immediate. Today, nearly 50 million people are living in condition of modern-day slavery. Throughout labor, human trafficking, and exploitation that continues in different forms. This reality calls for a clarity of purpose. Human dignity must be protected, consistent and without exception. Excellencies, Africa's history reflects both of suffering and strength. From the shores where millions were taken, to moments like Adwa, where dignity was defended with determination, our one principle remains constant. Dignity endures, and it demands recognition. Mr. President, the theme before us, justice in action, confronting history, advancing dignity, empowering future, calls for a steady and deliberated progress. It calls for implementation. It calls for partnership. It calls for accountability. As the Executive Secretary of IGAD has emphasized, justice gains meaning when action reflects memory. Excellencies, the United Nations provides the framework, member states provide the leadership, and together, progress becomes possible. Sustained implementation of commitment is essential. Continued cooperation is necessary, and shared responsibility must remain at the center of our effort. Mr. President, this day is a day of what humanity has endured. It is also a reminder of what humanity can correct. Through consistent effort, through principled action, and through collective resolve, we can continue to advance dignity and inclusion. Let this be a moment that strengthens that direction, and I thank you.
I thank the observer of the International Authority on Development. We have had the last speaker in this commemorative meeting. The Assembly has thus concluded its commemorative meeting to mark the International Day of Remembrance of the Victims of Slavery and Transatlantic Slave Trade. Action on the draft resolution submitted under this item will take place after the collection of the ballots for the appointment of members of the board of the 10-year framework of programs on sustainable consumption and production patterns. The Assembly has thus concluded this stage of its consideration of Agenda Item 119. The Assembly will consider Sub-Item 1 of Agenda Item 115 entitled Appointment of Members of the Board of the 10-year Framework of Programs on Sustainable Consumption and Production Patterns. Members will recall that the Assembly, by its Resolution 67/203 of 21 December 2012, decided to establish the 10-member board, consisting of 2 members from each United Nations General Group, Regional Group. In its Decision 67/564 of 16 September 2013, the Assembly decided that regional groups shall be authorized to nominate new members of the board. Furthermore, by its Resolution 69/214 of 19 December 2014, the Assembly decided that the duration of subsequent terms for members of the board shall continue to be 2 years, starting on 16 September of every second year, and that the United Nations regional groups may nominate one of their existing 2 members of the board for 1 consecutive term, while ensuring that no member state is eligible to serve more than 2 consecutive terms, and taking into account the importance of ensuring continuity and rotation in the work of the board. Members will also recall that in its Decision 78/418 A of 13 August 2024, the Assembly decided that the 2-year term of the members of the board shall begin on 21 March 2024, the date of their appointment, taking into account Resolution 69/214 of 19 December 2014. The Assembly subsequently appointed members of the board for terms ending on 20 March 2026. Consequently, the Assembly needs to appoint 10 members of the board for a new term of office. Bearing in mind the provisions of Resolution 69/214 as outlined above, I propose that the new 2-year term of the members of the board shall begin on the date of their appointment, that is today, 25 March 2026. May I take it that the Assembly wishes to proceed accordingly? It is so decided. In view of the request made at the 73rd plenary meeting held on 10 March 2026, the Assembly will now proceed to this appointment by secret ballot. With regard to the candidatures, I should like to inform members of the following nominations by regional groups. For the 2 seats from among the African states, only one endorsed state has been communicated, namely the Republic of South Africa. For the 2 seats from among the Asia-Pacific states, only one state has been communicated, namely India. For the 2 seats from among the Eastern European states, two states have been communicated, namely Hungary and the Russian Federation. For the 2 seats from among the Latin American and Caribbean states, the following 2 endorsed states have been communicated, namely Barbados and Mexico. For the 2 seats from among the Western European and other states, the following 2 endorsed states have been communicated, namely Finland and Germany. Before we begin the voting process, I should like to remind members that, pursuant to Rule 88 of the Rules of Procedure of the General Assembly, no representative shall interrupt the voting except on a point of order on the actual conduct of the voting. Any announcements, including those concerning withdrawals of candidatures, should therefore be made prior to the commencement of the voting process. That is to say, before the announcement of the beginning of the voting process. In addition, ballot papers will only be given to the delegates seated directly behind the country's nameplate. We shall now begin the voting process. Ballot papers marked A, B, C, D, and E will now be distributed, and the voting has thus begun. In accordance with Resolution 71/323 of 8 September 2017, the names of the states that have been communicated to the Secretariat at least 48 hours prior to the election today have been printed on the ballot papers for each of the regional groups. Only those candidates nominated by the regional groups are eligible for this appointment and are indicated on the ballot paper. I request representatives to use only those ballot papers that have been distributed and to put an X in the ballot boxes next to the names of states whom they wish to vote for. There shall be no write-ins. A blank ballot paper will be considered an abstention. If a ballot paper contains any notation other than votes in favor of eligible member states, those notations will be disregarded. I invite the representatives of the following states to serve as tellers and to accompany the conference officers as they collect the ballot papers: Brunei Darussalam, Ecuador, Italy, Lesotho, Montenegro, and Sweden. I invite the representatives of the flowing states to serve as tellers and to accompany the conference officers as they collect the ballot papers. Brunei Darussalam, Ecuador, Italy, Lesotho, Montenegro, and Sweden. Please proceed to collect the ballot papers. May I request delegations who have not voted to do so now by approaching the podium to cast their votes. The voting is now closed. No more ballot papers will be accepted. In the interest of time, the Assembly will now proceed to consider the other items announced in the United Nations Journal while the ballots are being counted. The Assembly has thus concluded this stage of its consideration of sub-item 1 of Agenda Item 115. The Assembly will resume its consideration of Agenda Item 119 entitled Commemoration of the Abolition of Slavery and the Transatlantic Slave Trade, to take action on a proposal announced in the journal. I give the floor to His Excellency Samuel Ogudzedo Ablakwa, Minister for Foreign Affairs of Ghana, on behalf of the African Group, to introduce Draft Resolution A/80/L.48.
The President of the General Assembly, Your Excellencies, permanent representatives, distinguished delegates, today we gather in solemn reflection on the International Day of Remembrance of the Victims of Slavery and the Transatlantic Slave Trade, a day when humanity pauses to remember millions of women, men, and children whose lives were stolen, whose dignity was denied, and whose humanity was questioned, yet whose resilience reshaped the moral arc of our shared history. This day is not merely an act of remembrance. It is a call to conscience. It reminds us that memory without action risks becoming silent, and silence has never been the ally of justice. Your Excellencies, in September 2025, during the general debate of the 80th session of the United Nations General Assembly, the President of Ghana, His Excellency John Dramani Mahama, announced that Ghana will introduce a draft resolution entitled Declaration of the Trafficking of Enslaved Africans and Racialized Chattel Enslavement of Africans as the gravest crime against humanity. 6 months to this very day, I have the distinct honor to present this resolution to the General Assembly on behalf of the African Group. This resolution does not create legal hierarchies of crime, as some have wrongly suggested. Neither is it about reopening history. It is about completing history. It does not target individual states, nor does it seek division. Rather, it establishes a principled framework for reconciliation grounded in truth. At its heart, this draft resolution is forward-looking and unifying. It is focused on truth, remembrance, education, and dialogue. It is grounded not in retribution, but in moral recognition. And it is intended to strengthen global efforts to combat racism, racial discrimination, and xenophobia in all its forms. Excellencies, its objectives are clear: to provide formal and unequivocal recognition within the United Nations system of the world-breaking and world-redefining impact of the enslavement of Africans and racialized chattel enslavement of Africans and people of African descent, to affirm their enduring consequences, not only for Africa and the people of African descent, but all of humanity, to reinforce ongoing global efforts toward reparatory justice through dialogue and cooperation, and to strengthen international solidarity in the fight against systemic racism and historical denialism. Distinguished delegates, the African Group expresses its sincere appreciation to all delegations for their constructive engagement throughout the negotiations. We believe that the present draft reflects the broadest possible views of member states on this important issue. Regrettably, legal technicalities and procedural arguments have been invoked to once again silence voices, to bury history, obscure clarity, and to prevent this noble institution from speaking plainly and firmly. But history does not disappear when ignored. Truth does not weaken when delayed. Crime does not rot, as we say in Africa. And justice does not expire with time. In affirming this declaration, we do more than honor memories. We strengthen the very foundations of justice upon which the United Nations was built. We affirm that human dignity is indivisible, that suffering must be acknowledged, and that reconciliation begins with truth courageously spoken. Your Excellencies, the founder of Ghana, Osajifo Dr. Kwame Nkrumah, proclaimed, quote, "Slavery was not born of racism. Rather, racism was a consequence of slavery. With this racial twist was invented the myth of color inferiority," unquote. Your Excellencies, the generation that founded this organization emerged from the ashes of global tragedy and pledged that humanity would never again look away from crimes that shock the conscience of humankind. Today, we are called to uphold that promise. The African Group, our co-sponsors, CARICOM, CELAC, our broad coalition of people with good conscience, including the NAACP, the Congressional Black Caucus, members of Parliament in the House of Commons, and other places, are sending a very clear message. They are calling upon all member states to stand on the right side of history and in our shared humanity to vote in favor of this resolution, and in doing so, reaffirm not only the past we remember, but the future we seek to build together. A future of social justice, a future of equality, and a future of mutual respect for human life. I thank you very much, Your Excellencies.
I thank the Minister for Foreign Affairs of Ghana. We shall now proceed to consider Draft Resolution A/80/L.48. I give the floor to the representative of the Secretariat.
Thank you, Mr. President. The present oral statement is made in the context of Rule 153 of the Rules of Procedure of the Assembly. The present statement has also been distributed to Member States. The request contained in Operative Paragraph 15 of the draft resolution would constitute an addition to the workload of the Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights and the Department for the General Assembly and Conference Management in 2027, and entail additional resource requirements net of staff assessment in the amount of $117,700 in 2027. Detailed cost estimates and their underlying assumptions for the requirements are provided in the annex to this statement, which has been circulated. Accordingly, should the General Assembly adopt the draft resolution, L48, additional resource requirements estimated in the amount of $117,700 net of staff assessment would be included in the proposed program budget for 2027 under Section 2, General Assembly and Economic and Social Council Affairs and Conference Management, and Section 24, Human Rights for the consideration of the General Assembly at its 81st session. In addition, an amount of $12,800 would be included under Section 36, staff assessment, to be offset by an equivalent amount under Income Section 1, income from staff assessment. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of the Secretariat. For your information, the draft resolution has closed for e-sponsorship. I give the floor to the representative of the Secretariat.
Mr. President, I should like to announce that since the submission of the draft resolution, and in addition to the delegations listed on the L document, the following countries have also become co-sponsors of A/80/L48: Antigua and Barbuda, Bahamas, Bangladesh, Belize, Brazil, Colombia, Haiti, Maldives, Pakistan, St. Lucia, Tajikistan, Timor-Leste, and the State of Palestine. If any other countries wish to co-sponsor L48, please signify by pressing the microphone button now. I see Kyrgyzstan, the Philippines, Cameroon, although Cameroon is already on the L document. That concludes additional co-sponsorship. Thank you, Mr. President.